Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. Tonight we have 2 hours of stories. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's see if we can reach 5 likes on this video. I think if you all liked on your main account and then also signed into a friend's account, we could probably get there. Anyways, sit back, do whatever it is that you do to relax, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I lived in a house with an extremely long, winding driveway. We grew up surrounded by the woods, and when it got late on summer evenings, and the sun finally set after busy days of playing with my neighborhood friends, the darkness swallowed up our little plot of land, and it seemed like there was no end to that sea of trees around us, like it extended into ink in every direction. Naturally, I was terrified of those dark woods for reasons I couldn't explain. So as I got older, doing outdoor chores at night got harder and harder. Sometimes I'd have to take furniture off of the porch right before a big storm was approaching, or else it'd be blown away. Sometimes I'd just have to take the trash to the curb. I ended up being assigned to that job out of all of my 4 brothers. I don't know why my mom picked me, but I assume it was because I was always the most cautious one of the 5 Swanson kids. The first time I had to take the trash to the curb at night, I begged my dad to go with me out of fear. I kept doing it, so eventually we just got into the habit of doing it together. He didn't seem to mind too much anyway. That is, until the night it happened. The sunset was beautiful that night. The fireflies danced under swirls of purple and orange. We get pretty sunsets all the time around here, but something about this one was different. It was like Mother Earth was rewarding us for our hard work on that day. We had just finished demolishing an old shed that got crushed under an even older tree, uprooted by a summer storm. The clouds seemed to gather like witches around a fire in the heart of the forest, blocking out the gibbous moon that stared down at us like our mom did when we were in trouble. Thanks to the cloud coverage, it was so dark that we could barely see our feet in front of us as we were walking that familiar path down the barely paved drive. My dad cracked some kind of joke that I can't recall, and I chuckled to ease the tension. I had taken to walking as quickly as possible down that winding path when it was dark out. I'm sure the reason for that is obvious. My dad could just about keep up with me, even when I was young and spry. And I wanted to spend as little time under that dark sky as possible. The trees on either side of the path loomed over us, but I could just barely make out the cloud-smeared stars past their jagged edges. I could hear my dad's footsteps behind me as I gripped the black trash bag closer, the plastic strip that made up the handle getting sweaty in my hand. I focused on that sound to calm myself as my nerves started acting up, anxiety nipping at my heels. Rhythmic were my dad's footsteps. He had a limp, had gotten his leg twisted up years back in a bad car crash, and it never quite healed right. The dull slap of his bad foot on the pavement steadied my thoughts. He was with me, and the world seemed safe. The woods even seemed almost warm. After what must have been at least a few minutes, I finally saw the end of the driveway. The stinky dumpster was a relief for once. It meant the trip was at least halfway over. I practically ran up to the dumpster, focusing on the rotten yellow of its lid rather than the thick woods ahead of us across the thin road that led to our house. I didn't want to look too deeply past that tree line. As I slammed the trash in, my dad passed me. I felt a cold chill pass down my spine when he stepped out onto the road, staring off into the woods, or maybe the sky. I couldn't tell with his back facing me. My thoughts were hijacked by the sensation that my rear was no longer protected by my dad's mystical presence. I shot that thought down. He wouldn't be able to protect me anyway, if there were really something wrong. "Weird night tonight, huh, kiddo?" My dad's rough voice came. I stifled an audible intake of air, not expecting him to say anything. He was a man of few words. I didn't know what he meant either, and I was already uneasy. Huh? Not really, I replied. It was just an average night, right? What was weird about it? I shut the lid to emphasize my point. I didn't want to seem rude, but I was done being here out so far away from the house, whose light was now a dim glimmer through the trees. As the path back curved sharply in at least 2 spots, I turned away and took a step or two, ready to head back as quickly as possible. Are you afraid? I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart stopped too. Everything stood still for a second. I couldn't even begin to formulate a reply. My breath caught in my frozen lungs. That was not my dad's voice. It felt like an eternity before I was able to even move an inch. Every fiber of my body wanting to flee. My only sanctuary was somehow wrong, and I didn't know why. I forced my feet to turn themselves around. Maybe my dad was just putting on a scary voice to prank me. He did that sometimes, knowing how cautious I was. Maybe he had gotten a frog in his throat. My mind clung to these fragile hopes as I looked back over my shoulder at him, hoping to gain some kind of information, or at least find out if he was okay or not. My dad was standing in the middle of the road with his back facing me. Dad, what's going on? I asked in a tiny, frail tone. My voice cracked sharply, almost quivering in dread. He gave no response. Then he slowly turned around, painfully slow, with inhuman, almost robotic movements, one foot after the other, one arm swiveling to face me, as if it were detached from his torso. His legs swiveled next, each part turning one after the other. His torso followed until finally his body fully faced me. Except for his head. His head was still backward. And then, that started to turn too. I shrank backward in horror beyond my control, my brain lit up with fear chemicals, my nerves suddenly blazing with a primal fear response. Everything about this was wrong, and I had to get away. Get away. Anywhere but here. I stood there, pissing my jorts in terror. For a good solid second further, he turned his head halfway before I bolted, and I'll regret that second before I started running for my whole life ahead of me, because I saw just a tiny bit of his face. Its face. It wasn't him. If you haven't gathered that already, I don't know what it was, but it wasn't him. My breath burned my lungs as I frantically scrambled back up the driveway, my vision going blurry. The clouds parted overhead, lighting my way back as my flip-flops slapped hard on the pavement. The gibbous moon trained its eyes on me from its seat in the ink-black sky, drinking in my fear. Behind me I heard something. Crunching, thumping, footsteps that didn't belong to my dad, plodding after me like a brown bear, too heavy, too disordered. No limp either. I remember running further on that night than my body wanted to, my legs nearly buckling out from under me. Adrenaline took over as I followed the black serpent of the driveway. My thoughts were a blur, panic thrumming through my veins. Every second half expecting to feel a cold, clammy hand finally gripping my shoulder. But the hand never stole my soul away from my flesh. I pounded up the stairs, threw open the front door, slammed it shut with all my strength, and locked it as quickly as my shaking, sweaty fingers would allow. With my back pressed against the wall, I slid down and wrapped my arms around my knees. My face burned from the tears, the warmth of home doing nothing to comfort me as I struggled to catch my breath, my feet aching. A few shuddering, painful gasps were all I could manage before another thought trapped me in frozen, stiff silence. What if the lock wasn't enough? What if it got in anyway? My eyes flicked up to the window in the door. I was terrified I'd catch another glimpse of that ghastly, pale thing that might have once been my dad's familiar face, but seeing the emptiness of the night sky was somehow worse. I took another breath as I got to my feet, gripping the door handle, as if in the event of the lock failing, my own grip strength would keep the thing out. Looking back on it, that's absolutely laughable, but at the time I was acting on pure instinct. Which might explain why I stupidly peered out through the glass, scanning for any signs of life. I strained my eyes, trying in vain to see anything past the tree line. Even with the clouds parted, the woods held on to their secrets with a tight grip. After a minute or two, finally something changed. The dim light couldn't hide the trees shaking, the leaves parting, and something... I heard a scream. I leapt out of my skin. An outstretched fist connected with something meaty. My brother Eric materialized out of thin air, the door behind him ever so slightly ajar. "What the..." he complained, rubbing his cheek. I cussed him out, my panic and rage overflowing, my head shaking from how hard I was spitting insults at him. After several minutes of back and forth arguing, I finally calmed down enough to explain the situation to him. I'm sure it made absolutely no sense whatsoever. When I finished, he just gave me a weird look, like I had grown a horn on my forehead. "Dude, are you okay? Have you been taking your meds?" he asked quietly, shifting his position in discomfort. Something about his body language said, "Are you high?" This only pissed me off further. "You either need to believe me or get out of here right now," I shouted enraged. "Make yourself useful and go tell Mom to call the cops. There's something out there, something bad." He stepped back at my yelling, but didn't go anywhere. He rubbed his shoulder, looking aside. Okay, I believe you. Jesus, calm down." We both fell quiet, looking at each other for a minute. Then I focused my eyes out the window again. Nothing. Empty front porch, empty yard, empty driveway. The faceless woods still met my gaze. "It's just, your story doesn't really make a lot of sense. Dad's been out on a fishing trip for a few days now. Did Mom not tell you?" I've always had a very odd relationship with my imagination. My imagination and daydreaming were so vivid as a child that it kept me occupied throughout most days, for better or worse. My dreams were no different. Some days I would have the most breathtakingly vivid dreams that were so beautiful. However, I found out from a pretty early age that this imagination came with a price. The horrific dreams and hallucinations started when I was around 5 or 6. I would have hallucinations of angels coming to me, standing in doorways, holding me in my dreams and showing me things. Now, being raised in a religious household, you would think that I found this comforting, but they always terrified me. The angels that I would see had no faces, and when I met them in my dreams, their embrace was freezing to the touch. There was no comfort I found in them, and to be honest, this is probably one of the reasons I fell out of religion so early on in my childhood. I can't exactly remember all of the things that they showed me in my dreams. I know they weren't all scary or bad, but it was always unsettling at the least. But my hallucinations, while the good ones were still there sometimes, became more and more horrifying as I got older. Sometimes when I'd wake up from a terrible dream, me being an elementary-aged kid would of course call for my parents, and one of my parents would come. Usually they would come right to my bedside and comfort me, pat my head, give me a kiss on the forehead, and go on their way back to sleep. But I remember on some occasions, I would get even more scared when my parents, or what I thought was my parents, came to comfort me. Because sometimes all they would do is peek their head around the corner and stare at me for minutes. With it being just about pitch black in my room, with only maybe the moonlight shining in from the window as light, I could only make out the shape of someone's head. There were never any facial features visible, just kind of a white blob. I would call out, "Mom" or "Dad" multiple times, but I would never get a reply. When this happened, I remember always thinking, why is mom or dad taller than usual? But me being so young never registered that it could be something else other than my loving parents coming to check on me when I called for help. When I would finally say, "You're scaring me," after the uncomfortably long time of them just staring at me, the head would disappear back into the hallway. I know now, of course, that in these situations, those were most definitely not my parents. I would only become more and more aware of these tall ones as time went on. I started seeing them in the events I just described at around age 8, and it got worse at around age 9. I remember being around grade 4 going into one of the school washroom stalls. After I was done, I headed to the sink to wash my hands. The sinks were directly ahead of the stalls, so when looking into the mirror, I had complete vision of the stalls. I was looking down at my hands while lathering soap on them, and when I glanced back up at the mirror, I could see someone's head peeking from over the bathroom stall that I had just come out of. The head had a normal-looking men's haircut. The thing that I noticed first is that there should have just been enough of the head visible to see its eyes, or at least its eyebrows. But there was nothing. I completely froze. Even after 14 or 15 years, the memory and feeling is seared into my brain. It was completely still. I had really hoped that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I didn't hear a sound coming from the thing. No breathing, no shuffling, no anything. After the initial reaction of freezing up, I turned around, hoping that it wouldn't be there, but it was. I once again couldn't bring myself to move. Even though it had no eyes, I could still feel its gaze upon me. I don't know how long I stood there, but after a while, its head very slowly started to shrink down out of sight. After I couldn't see its head anymore, I quickly looked down towards the bottom opening of the stall, and I saw its feet. This particular tall one had standard brown business-type shoes. Directly after noticing this, I finally heard something. It began fidgeting with the door. Looking back on it, it was like it had no idea how the door worked. The idea of being face to face with that thing overrided anything else, and I began to run. Just as I exited the bathroom, I heard the stall door creak open. That day was the start of my personal hell. The tall ones would only begin to appear more often. A week after this encounter, I was in my classroom during our history class. I remember hearing the distant and slow clacking of shoes, the sound you usually hear when a teacher is walking down the hallway. I didn't think too much of it, as it's something that I heard quite often, until I noticed that the last time I heard them was when they were directly outside our classroom. I turned my head toward the doorway, and when I did, I jumped out of my chair and stumbled backward and fell against the wall. I couldn't do anything except scream. It was there again. The same tall one as in the bathroom stall, except this time I could see its entire body except for its head. It was too tall for the door. Its outfit was that you would see at a law firm. Very tidy, suit and tie. You get it. The thing had very deformed hands. It had extremely stubby fingers, and the hand itself looked like a blob of flesh just mashed together. Everyone obviously was looking at me, then started to look toward the door and, as you probably suspected, just looked back at me with a mix of confusion and fear as to why I was screaming inconsolably. My teacher rushed to me and tried to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. It felt like if I stopped looking at it, it would come snatch me away and I would never be seen again. After what I think was a minute or so, as I was still crying uncontrollably, I saw the thing fully move for the first time. Usually this would be comedic, but this was horrifying. It didn't turn around and walk away like a human, but instead just took one massive, slow, exaggerated sidestep out of view. Imagine that as you like, because I don't even want to describe how unnatural this movement was. My parents were called and I was taken home. It took a long time for my parents to get anything out of me. I did eventually tell them, and they took me to a child psychiatrist. They always knew I had hallucinations that scared me from time to time, but after seeing me like how I was that day, they decided that was the final straw. The psychiatrist took it as an overactive imagination and told my parents that hallucinations during childhood are not that unusual and that they would eventually subside. He told my parents to come again if this kept occurring on a regular basis. Well, the visions of the tall ones kept occurring, and I was put on meds a short time afterward. They didn't do a thing to help, and after a while, I started seeing tall ones other than the businessman. After about a year or two of constant hell, and though it was still hell, I was able to manage these visions a lot better. Or so I thought. I won't describe each and every one of these encounters, but I will tell you the one that landed me in a psychiatric ward. I was around 13 at the time, and just like the rest of the encounters I've told you about, I was also at school. I was outside during our recess time, and I was trying my best to be social with the other kids, so I was playing some soccer with them. At some point during the game, I was looking across the field towards the neighboring street when I saw a flash of red kind of dash in and out of sight between two houses. Something about it immediately set me off. Mind you, no tall one I had seen at this point moved quickly. I tried my best to ignore it and continue with the game. Some time later, I looked back towards those houses, and once again I froze like I was 9 again. There was an extremely tall woman in a red dress standing across the street. Something about this one was different. It was extremely tall, maybe around 10 feet. I tried my best to do the calming exercises that I had learned, trying my best not to lose it. I brought myself to look at it again, and it started to make those slow, exaggerated strides toward me that I had become accustomed to seeing. Then, without warning, it started running. This was the most scared I've been in my entire life. This was something new that I couldn't deal with. The way it ran was like it was dislocating every bone in its legs. I couldn't even describe it. I screamed and I ran as fast as I could. I ran inside the school and tried to find anyone that could help me. I have no idea why, but I couldn't find anyone inside the school. It was like everyone had disappeared. I heard the door that I entered the school with slam open. Loud, pounding, fast footsteps followed. I knew that it was the tall one. I also heard, for the first time, a noise come from the thing itself. It was an unbelievably loud, muffled scream, as if someone was screaming into a pillow, except it didn't sound human at all. Something about that noise made me give up. It filled me with such an unimaginable sense of dread that I just stopped running. I heard the sound of the pounding footsteps get closer. I gave myself the mercy of not looking at it before it caught up to me. I basically had accepted my death at that point. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. According to the police, I was in complete hysterics. I lashed out at everyone who would come close to me trying to calm me down. When I told them what happened, I learned that I had never actually gone inside the school. It all happened outside in the field. I also had lacerations on the back of my right arm and back. Though no one is quite sure where they came from, they assumed that I somehow did it to myself during whatever happened. To make a long story short, I stayed in the psych ward for quite a few months. But funnily enough, the visions of the tall ones completely went away after that. But I could never shake the feeling that maybe something could have been real about them. I am writing this now because 10 years later, I was in a bathroom stall again at work yesterday. I went to go escape from my duties for a while to just go on my phone when I heard the bathroom door creak open, and those familiar slow, clacking footsteps made my entire body go cold. I could recognize them anywhere. Those familiar brown shoes came to a stop directly in front of my stall. I'm a witch. While that may sound far-fetched, it is true. I've always at least somewhat believed in the supernatural. Call it instinct, call it superstition, or call it naivety. No matter what, I can work with magic and spirits well enough. I live in Colorado near the mountains. Well, we all know that the Appalachian Mountains are scary. Most people don't realize the horror of their younger cousins. They are young, and they lack any of the ancient life of their elders, but their horrors are far less known. But I'm getting sidetracked. Let's get into the meat of the story. I woke up at about 6 in the morning on a Saturday when this began. I was going to head into the mountain forest at that time, so I was preparing accordingly. I put on my favored old hunting boots, a warded flannel jacket, and I wore a belt with an abundance of pouches. I put my ritual knife, a crescent-shaped blade with a bone handle and several spells on it, in its sheath and slung my rifle over my shoulder before heading out. After all, I know better than to assume the woods are safe. The 20-minute drive to my little dead end of a dirt road was calm. If only the whole trip was like that. In the early morning chill, I trudged uphill to a brilliant purple and blue clearing of wildflowers, where I crouched down and started cutting some columbines by the stem. The morning dew fresh upon my skin. Calmly I started to cut through my next set of flowers, some larkspurs which were flourishing, their harvesting accompanied by the song of birds. Thus I stepped into my final harvest. I cut some bluebells by the stem and started placing them in a pouch. As I was crouched by them, I heard a twig break. I snapped my head up and held my knife in front of me, but there was nothing there. I assumed it was just some animal, but that was my first mistake. I walked onward towards my next destination, a small stream a mile or so away. I walked through and my eyes watched for familiar landmarks. A oddly bent tree here, a dilapidated wooden structure there. But as often as there were familiar landmarks, there were unfamiliar things. A tree had some fresh damage which might have just been claw marks. A little fox den a few meters away from my path collapsed. And a mutilated corpse. That was something else I should have noted. I approached the corpse only to see what appeared to be some sort of deer. I've never really been disturbed by death or gore, so I felt it would be worth it to take this animal corpse, which had clearly fallen upon a trap, or got a stray buckshot striking it or something. After all, it would be a waste to just leave it behind. So I got to work, blood pouring into a preset jar, meat squelching as I skinned the creature. As I methodically skinned the creature, I met its glassy eyes. There was no life in them, but there was something. In the reflection of the eye, I saw something rush between two trees. On instinct, I grabbed my .22 rifle. It wouldn't do much, but it would scare off a threat, and I started poking around, my bloody knife resting in its sheath. But nothing was there. Not just no animal, but nothing. It was dead silent. There was only my breath and the sound of my fingernail tapping against the gun's barrel. I mumbled a quiet prayer. Lady Artemis, mistress of the hunt in the wilds, please grant me safety in this wood. And another. I call upon the green, grant me safe passage and forage. And several other prayers. I wasn't actually scared then, but I wish I had been. Maybe things would be different then. As my search yielded no results, I returned to the carcass and continued harvesting, the empty eye sockets peering into me. As I finished harvesting the corpse, it was midday, and I had used a small tarp I kept in one of my larger bags to carry it over my shoulder as a rucksack I carried onto the stream. As I walked, the forest returned to life, and the hairs on the back of my neck that I didn't know were raised settled down. I quickly checked my phone as I arrived at the creek. It was 12:20, and there was no hint of any need to return home. I filled some jars with water from the stream and started walking upstream to see if anything else I wanted was around. I saw a few golden chanterelles I harvested, and also some fly amanitas I avoided. But for the next hour or so, there was nothing else of note. No silence or stalking creatures or odd landmark. But that was before I saw the circle. It was on top of a mostly flat boulder. Faded chalk marks made a circle around a core carving, which looked like a spiral with some sort of runes around it. The carving was caked in a red-brown substance. As I stood by the circle, the air felt off. The gentle breeze stilled and the animals grew silent. This place caught my interest. I scribbled the symbols down in a notebook, a set of 5 lines pointing away from another line, a branching line which resembled a tree, something that seemed to be a lightning bolt, and a set of curved lines sticking together. I resolved to try and figure out this weird spot. Another foolish mistake. It took several hours to copy it all down, and the sky was dark with clouds. I could smell the rain coming. I had to get home soon. After all, I was just barely 16 and got my license barely a month ago. So I rushed down the mountainside with far less caution. I ran past the dilapidated building, and the weird tree and the dilapidated building. When I noticed the building for the second time, I realized something was off. How did I get turned around in a place I have roamed since I was 12 and got my first knife? And as I paused, I noticed something in the trees. There was a flash of something in between the trees. So again I grabbed my rifle and moved to inspect the area with some muttered prayers. There was again no life, but there was some odd symbols on the trees. Forgetting my circumstances, I copied them down. But I then remembered my circumstances and slashed through the symbols with my enchanted ritual knife. Then I turned and continued hurrying downhill. Now I got through the flowers and reached my car, a beat-up little pickup truck. I quickly placed the deer harvest in the back and tied it down and slipped into the driver's seat. As I closed the door, I noticed something. It was hidden between a tree, but I saw its arm. It clearly bent with at least 2 joints before it slipped into the dark, and its 6 bloody clawed hand held into glassy dark eyes. I never was one to run. I punched my bully when he was twice my weight as a little girl. I drew a knife on the creep who was following me when I was 12. I pointed my .22 rifle at the mountain lion that nearly pounced on me during my first hunting trip. And I stood my ground against the spirit which entered my home and terrorized me and my siblings. But this thing was different. I felt my instinct to fight overwhelmed. It was something greater than me. It was powerful, and I was just some squirrel or mouse. I tore out of the little dead end fast enough that I nearly shot off the road when I came on a turn. By the time I got on a road where I may have interacted with another driver, my fear had settled. Instead of rushing away, I focused on every little detail around me. I scanned for any marking or movement. I analyzed every landmark possible. But now as I saw my phone tell me it was 7 p.m., I was in town. As I pulled into my driveway and started unloading my loot, I saw something on the side of the trunk. It was a set of 6 scrapes. I rushed to store my loot and then grabbed some chalk from my magical workspace. I scribbled down a pentacle and some protective sigils at the doors and windows. I started to make some spell bottles when my mother caught notice of my erratic behavior. "Dear, what happened?" she asked. She was well aware that I didn't react like this normally. When I didn't respond, she continued, "It's okay, dear. What's going on?" "Mom, I have to set up some protections for the house. Something might have followed me." I answered as I placed some iron nails and my blood in a jar and murmured some protective charms before moving on to the next. I spoke up. "Tell the others that this is a ghost thing and to stay put." My mother, unsurprisingly, did not take my orders and instead asked a question. "What do you mean by ghost thing?" As I made my last spell bottle, I answered, "I know you don't believe, but there is some sort of spirit which was causing me issues." I quickly ran past her into our yard and buried 1 bottle in each corner of the property and ran back inside. I then heard my siblings scamper out of their rooms. My older sister, Erin, looked at my disheveled state. She quickly grabbed her own hunting knife and rifle before returning and speaking. So, Amy, what's happening? My younger brother, Jacob, spoke up this time. Sis, what's happening? I'm scared. Following this, my little sister Elizabeth spoke up. Yeah, is it another ghost? This time I'll fight it. I was pretty confident before this, but now it was a bit more serious. I breathed before speaking. You all should be fine. Remember the charms I made you? I began, getting a series of nods. You should be fine if you have them with you. And Liz, you're too young to fight this one. This seemed to satisfy my younger siblings, and they went back to their room, but Erin stood firm. I don't know anything about magic, but this is serious, isn't it? Erin said. Our mother decided to give us some tea, and I heard our father settle down next to us in a chair. I took my tea as I spoke up before the older family members. So I get that you all are probably more concerned, so I'll tell you the important stuff. Essentially, there is a spirit or monster in the woods which was stalking me, and it scratched my truck, and I don't want to risk you all. My family was not satisfied with that, but I didn't give any more information. Throughout the following week of school and me trying to figure out the magical nonsense, I've been seeing things. The claw marks, the 5-fingered sigil, and the other sigils. Well, I have done my due diligence in destroying them. I need to solve this. This Saturday I will go into the woods and seal that thing. No matter what. It started as a prank. 3 friends and I were hanging out one night, bored and restless, when someone brought up an old urban legend. A game where you could see your final 5 seconds. The legend said if you closed your eyes at exactly midnight, held your breath and counted to 5, you'd get a flash of your last 5 seconds alive. Just 5 seconds, a small glimpse into your end. None of us believed it, but then midnight hit. We decided to try it for a laugh. I remember rolling my eyes and thinking how ridiculous it was. We closed our eyes, took a deep breath, and counted down in unison. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nothing happened. We laughed it off and went on with our night, but then we started seeing things. The first time it happened, I was brushing my teeth. Out of nowhere, I was somewhere else, standing on a desolate road under a blackened sky. An overwhelming dread filled me, but I couldn't move. Something was coming toward me, something fast and heavy. Then I was back in my bathroom, shaking. My heart pounded, and I could feel the taste of copper in my mouth. I tried to laugh it off as a daydream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. The next morning, my friend Dave looked like he hadn't slept. His skin was pale, eyes wide and darting. When I asked him what was wrong, he just muttered, "I saw it." When I pressed him, he said he'd had a vision too, standing in a pitch-black room, a sense of suffocating dread pressing in on him, and something slowly scraping along the walls, drawing closer with each second. It didn't stop. Over the next few days, the visions became more intense. Each time they lasted exactly 5 seconds, and each time the terror grew. We saw flashes of different places, abandoned rooms, darkened hallways, empty roads, places we'd never been, and each time there was something horrifyingly close. I'd hear footsteps or feel a presence I couldn't see, breathing on the back of my neck, lingering at the edge of my vision. One by one, we all became wrecks, sleepless, jumpy, always looking over our shoulders. We'd call each other late at night, desperate to understand what was happening. Dave was the first to say it. I think we saw our deaths. It sounded absurd, but deep down I knew he was right. We caught glimpses of our last moments, and now they were creeping closer, coming to claim us. The visions became more frequent, and every time, they'd change, like they were updating, getting closer to where we were in real life. 2 weeks in, Dave stopped answering his phone. I went to his place to check on him, and his roommate said he hadn't come home the night before. They found him 2 days later, his car abandoned on a lonely road, the exact spot I'd seen in my first vision. His cause of death? A hit and run, on an empty stretch with no witnesses. One by one my friends vanished after that. Each of them was found in a place that had appeared in their visions. They'd seen it coming just as I had, and they couldn't stop it. They couldn't run from their final 5 seconds. Now I'm the last one left. Every night the visions come stronger, clearer. I know exactly where it's going to happen. A place I've never been, but a place I feel drawn to every time I close my eyes, and I can't fight the pull. Every night the urge to go there grows stronger, and I know that one day soon I won't be able to resist. So, if you ever hear about the game where you can see your last 5 seconds, I beg you don't play it. Those 5 seconds aren't a warning. They're a promise, and when you've seen them, they'll come for you. Because in the end, you can't outrun what's already written. I'm writing this here because I don't know what else to do. Let me start from the start. I lived with my 2 roommates, Carmen and James, in a typical apartment off campus. The 3 of us shared a fridge, and space was pretty tight, but we'd worked out as a good system to avoid disagreements, ensuring that each of us had our own shelf, and anything in other areas of the fridge was labeled. Carmen and James had been living in the apartment for a semester prior to me moving in, and while I was worried initially that the 2 of them might be cliquey, they were very welcoming. Both of them were straight-talking and adult without being rude or blunt, which was so refreshing after my experiences with some terrible roommates in places I'd lived before. Everything was going smoothly. No moldy food, leftovers kept on our personal shelves, and boundaries respected. That was until the morning I opened the fridge, bleary-eyed and looking for coffee creamer, and found a weird jar on my shelf. What looked like gnarled roots were suspended in cloudy liquid that swirled as I examined the jar in my hand. The jar was old-fashioned, sealed with a 2-part canning lid that seemed stuck tight. I'd never seen Carmen or James have anything like that in the fridge before, and in my mind, I groped around for rationale as to how this could have showed up. As I struggled to open the lid, it finally loosened, not with the fresh pop of a sterile jar, but with the gritty sensation of corroded metal loosening its grip on rust. This jar looked like it had been there for years. I quickly screwed it shut again, not wanting to experience the smell of what was inside. My fingers ran over something that felt like paper on the bottom of the jar. I checked the lid was on tight before turning over the jar. There, on the base, was a dog-eared label with words written in old-fashioned cursive. To bind. Did either of you buy this? I asked Carmen and James, but they both said no, barely paying attention. If someone's messing with me, just stop. It's not funny. I told them both, but neither of them took responsibility. It was too early to argue, so I shrugged and threw the whole jar in the trash. The next week, nothing else weird happened, and I started to forget about the jar that had just showed up in the fridge. That was until the morning that James yelled my name from across the house. "Emma?" he shouted, and I immediately jumped up and headed downstairs to see what the matter was. It wasn't like him to randomly yell for me, and I could tell by his tone that something was wrong. James was stood by the fridge, his face twisted into an expression of disgust. "Emma, what is this?" he shouted as he opened the door. I jumped back as he revealed the fridge was crawling with maggots. Their pale, segmented bodies were pulsing in sick rhythm as they wiggled up the inside walls of the fridge, each one swollen with a glistening sheen. In the center of the fridge was a mass of maggots and writhing clusters, and I realized with horror that they were concentrated around my box of leftover pizza, the pizza I'd ordered just the night before. Emma, answer me. What is this? I was frozen with disgust, and my voice sounded stuttery and weak. I don't know, James. This has nothing to do with me, I swear. Then why are they coming from your pizza box? I recoiled as James grabbed my box of pizza, seemingly so full of anger and adrenaline that he didn't care about the maggots crawling all over it, which scattered to the floor around our feet. The air puffed with spores that made me cough as he opened the lid. The once cheesy slices nearly unrecognizable, swollen with mold, shades of green, black, and white, spreading across the surface in fuzzy patches. Some spots seemed slick and slimy. Others looked almost bubbly. Amid the rotting mess, maggots swarmed over each slice, their pale bodies weaving in and out of the gooey, decomposing crust. The air was filled with the dense, sour stench of decay and whispery, wet squelching of their bodies sliding against each other. The sight of the decay inside the box was so shocking that I almost didn't notice the message on the inside of the lid, scrawled in harsh capital letters. Enjoy while it lasts. James tilted the box to look at the message. What does this mean, Emma? I don't know. The pizza was fresh. That message wasn't there last night. So you're saying that me or Carmen must have done this? Why would we want to nuke our own fridge with maggots? No, that's not what I'm saying. This is messed up. James' eyes were full of hard rage that I hadn't seen before, and I was almost as scared of him as I was of the maggots. I don't even want to hear how this happened. It's your mess, clean it up, and you need to replace all of our food that's been ruined by this. This is unbelievable, Emma. I really thought we could trust you. He threw the pizza box on the counter and stormed from the room. I cleaned it all up, filling up trash bags while crying with frustration and fear. I was so confused. There had been no hint of any decay when I'd eaten the pizza last night, and I'd simply thrown the leftovers in the fridge thinking I'd eat them later today. I didn't have the money to buy an entire fridge's worth of food for 3 people, and I was sick with worry that my living situation was descending into the same mess of hostility that I'd experienced before. I spent about an hour on my knees in my rubber gloves, scooping up handfuls of maggots and dumping them in boiling water to kill them, then scrubbing the fridge with bleach. Neither James nor Carmen mentioned the incident to me again, although both of them had noticeably cooled towards me. And I spent as much time in my room as I could to avoid any awkward confrontations. Each time I opened the fridge, I braced myself, terrified that something else would appear. And I was right to be afraid, because a few nights later it happened again. I opened the fridge to grab a snack, only to find a plate on my shelf, front and center. On it was a slice of cake sat upright with a candle on the top, as if ready to present it to a birthday girl. But the cake was old-looking, sagging and sunken. It looked kind of familiar, frosting a sickly shade of green, surrounded by hardened crumbs, and speckled with confetti like sprinkles. My stomach dropped as I noticed the letters scrawled across the top in smeared icing. The first few letters of my name. M. It was unmistakably the same cake from my 10th birthday. I remembered that the frosting was a hideous shade of green because my mom had added too much food coloring. How could a slice of it be here, now, almost a decade later? Emma? Carmen's voice cut sharply through my thoughts and I jumped. She was standing in the doorway, arms crossed. I felt like I'd been caught red-handed, guilty of some crime I had no part in, and I tried to use my body to block the cake, but the look in my eyes must have told her that there was something wrong. What now? She asked, walking over to the fridge and peering over my shoulder. Her eyes widened as she spotted the plate, and her mouth curled in disdain. You can't seriously expect us to believe this isn't yours. What? No, I stammered, trying to find the right words, but she cut me off. James told me about the maggots, and now this? A slice of rotten cake with your name on it? Her eyes were cold and sharp with accusation. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Emma, but it's sick. I swear, Carmen, I didn't put this here. I said, my voice filled with desperation. I have no idea how any of this is happening. She snorted, folding her arms tighter. You're telling me that a weird cake with your name on it just magically appeared in our fridge? Do you even hear how insane that sounds? I know how it sounds, I whispered. My voice was brittle with shame. But I'm not doing this. I haven't done any of it. Carmen shook her head. Her face was filled with disappointment, her eyes wrinkled with disgust, but like she was contemplating a stranger doing something unsanitary. I'd hoped that some fragile trust was still there, but each syllable she spoke tore it down. We were actually happy when you moved in. We thought you'd be different, but you've brought nothing but weirdness into our home. First the maggots and now this. James and I shouldn't have to deal with constant gross surprises in the fridge. Carmen, please, you have to believe me. I don't have to do anything, she snapped. We're going to have to reconsider this whole living arrangement. Later that night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, replaying the argument with Carmen over and over in my head. I felt like I was going crazy, but I knew I wasn't responsible for this. Every other area of my life was healthy and happy. All I could think, unlikely as it seemed, was that James and Carmen were playing a trick on me. I didn't feel safe. I couldn't face a confrontation with them, and even if I could, our relationship would be forever tainted by what had happened. I needed to talk to someone who might have an outside perspective on all this. I picked up my phone and called my mom. Hi, sweetheart. She sounded cheerful at first, but her tone shifted when she heard the strain in my voice. Emma, is everything okay? I hesitated, unsure how to even begin, but eventually the whole story spilled out. I told her about the maggots, the old cake with my name on it, and the jar of roots with the faded label. She was silent for a moment. A jar of roots? Are you sure that's what it was? Yes, I replied. It looked ancient, like it had been in the fridge for decades, and on the bottom there was a label. It said, "To bind." Do you know what that could mean? There was a long pause before my mom spoke again, and when she did, her voice was hushed, threaded with a fear I'd never heard before. Emma, there's something I haven't told you about our family. I thought, well, I hoped it would never be necessary, but hearing this, it sounds like... She trailed off, and I felt her weighing the words she spoke next. It sounds like an old ritual your great-grandmother once used. She was known to keep jars of herbs and roots, things meant to bind, to protect the family from harm. A chill ran through me. Bind us from what, exactly? I don't know all the details, she admitted, a soft tremble in her voice. But I do know that these bindings were meant to keep something at bay, to trap it or hold it back from affecting us. Emma, you didn't open the jar, did you? I felt my skin prickle, goosebumps raising as a wave of cold washed over me. Not completely. Mom, what if I did? A shaky breath escaped her, like she was trying to steady herself. Honestly, I don't know. I never believed much in the family stories, thought they were just superstitions. But I remember the jars and how your great-grandmother would never let anyone open them. She told me, never break the seal on a binding jar. Otherwise, what's inside might come for us. A thick silence settled between us as I processed her words, feeling like I'd unearthed the family secret that should have stayed buried. This couldn't be real. Surely there was no such thing as witchcraft or spirits. But as I cast my mind back to the stale cake and the writhing maggots, it all seemed way too weird to have any type of rational explanation. Mom, I finally whispered, what if I come stay with you for a while? I need to get away from all this. Of course, sweetheart. Come home. We'll sort this out together. She had the practiced steadiness in her voice of every parent that talks of Santa, tells you that pets go to a farm, or assures you that everything will be all right. I packed my things the next day, shoving everything into my bags hurriedly without any type of organization. I explained to Carmen and James that I'd pay the rent until my notice period was up, but I'd be leaving that day. They barely looked at me as I left, and I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't blame them after everything that had happened, but it still hurt. A strange loneliness crept over me as I left the apartment and headed back to my childhood home. When my mom greeted me at the door, I melted into her warm hug, feeling the weight of the past few days begin to ease just slightly. That night we spent the evening watching crappy romance shows on Netflix, talking about anything but what had happened. It was early the next morning when I went to the kitchen, still groggy with sleep. My mom was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee. "Morning," she said with a tentative smile. There was some kind of current in the air, a chill that seemed like more than a drought. I think, deep down, I knew then that something was wrong, but I tried to pretend it was another normal morning, that I'd open the fridge door, grab some orange juice, and everything would be fine. But pretending was useless. It took me a moment to process what was inside the fridge. In front of me sprawled a massive raw organ, fleshy and grotesque, throbbing and twitching with life. Its surface was a tangled mess of bulging veins and thick, sinewy fibers, each strand shining with wetness. The swollen blood vessels twisted over it like bloated worms, their contents sloshing with each faint throb. It sat in a thick pool of viscous, nearly black blood that dripped lazily off the shelf and splattered onto the floor with wet, sticky slaps. The coppery, metallic stench coated the insides of my nostrils, so thick and rancid, it felt like it was crawling down my throat, filling me with a nausea that clawed its way up from my gut. I stumbled back, gagging and clamping my hand over my mouth. This thing, it looked like a nightmare pulled from the depths of some twisted horror. Something so strong and obscene, it felt like the air itself recoiled around it. This was something that had no place in any fridge, let alone my mom's. On the shelf below, obscured by the shadow cast by the huge organ, another jar caught the faint glint of the fridge light. It was nearly identical to the one I'd found in the apartment, a murky jar filled with dark, viscous liquid and tangled, gnarled roots. But there was something different about this jar. A faded label clung to the side, the same spidery cursive as before spelling out the words, "To unbind." I only realized my mom was by me when her shaking hands clasped my arm. Her face was completely pale. "Emma, this jar? This shouldn't be here." I didn't want to believe this was happening, and it took so much effort to face the situation, not to run screaming, but I wanted to be strong for my mom. "What do you mean, to unbind? Is this the thing I let out?" Before she could answer, a strange low noise filled the kitchen, like something huge exhaling. The air filled with a whispering, crackling sound like the rustling of dry leaves, and underneath, a crackling noise like something brittle breaking. It was suddenly so cold, so damp even inside the room, like the air in the middle of a forest in a rainstorm. I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the jar as the roots inside it started to twitch. At first I thought it was a trick of my eyes, a glimpse of a reflection moving, but then, unmistakably, they started to coil around each other, gripping and undulating like a nest of snakes. My mom's hand gripped my arm tighter, seemed so small and fragile. "Emma, shut the fridge. Don't touch it. We need to..." But it was too late. The jar's lid spun around, loosening with a grinding crick, then a loud hiss as the lid popped off, filling the kitchen with the sour, sharp smell of decay. The dark liquid in the jar overflowed as the roots began to uncoil, slowly creeping out of the jar like blackened fingers reaching out for us. My mom backed away. Her voice was filled with terror and urgency. "Emma, get away from it." I staggered back, so scared but unable to look away. as the roots began to slither out of the jar, squirming and stretching like the probing limbs of a hungry parasite. They crept out of the fridge with a slow, sickening purpose, inching toward us, each twisted tendril writhing and extending like the grasping arms of something pulled from a nightmare. Then, with a stabbing jerk, the roots shot forward, wrapping themselves around my mom's ankle. She let out a primal cry of shock and surprise that twisted the deepest parts of me as the roots tightened and pulled her back, and she fell to the ground with a sickening, dense crack as her head hit the tile floor. Blood ran down from her hairline. Her eyes glassed over in shock as she whimpered with pain. I realized then what the roots were trying to do. They were trying to pull her towards the fridge. "Mom!" I shrieked, grabbing her arms and pulling with all my strength, but the roots were relentless, tightening their hold the more that I pulled her away. The roots were throbbing as if something dark and alive cursed through them, and I could feel their strength, unnatural and monstrous. They were tied around her ankle like a ligature, and the skin underneath was raw and red, bruises blooming purple beneath their grip. "Emma, it's feeding," she gasped, her voice rasping and breathy with pain. I clung to her, pulling desperately, my hands gripping so tightly I no longer cared if it hurt her. My vision blurred with tears, panic filling every part of me as I choked on my own sobs. The roots felt stronger with every second, as if they were draining her life, and I knew I couldn't hold out much longer. There at the edge of the kitchen table, I spotted a butter knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Keeping one arm wrapped around her, I reached out with shaking fingers, grabbing the knife and gripping it hard, my fingernails cutting into my palm. With all the strength I had left, I brought it down on the roots, slashing wildly and screaming like I was possessed. The dull blade barely pierced the thick, fibrous surface of the roots, but still I hacked and sawed. My teeth were gritted tight as the knife slipped and skidded against the sinewy mass, tearing jagged gouges in the roots. But despite my ineffective weapon, it seemed like it was working. Every wound gushed with black fluid, and the roots shuddered under the assault. They started twisting violently as if in pain, splattering my face with sticky black droplets, tasting like tar and decay. The roots recoiled from every jagged hack I laid into them, writhing and convulsing, the dark liquid making a mess of glossy smears across the tiles. As they started to loosen, I felt a wave of giddy disbelief wash over me, the same way that prey must feel escaping a predator. And suddenly they retreated, and I pulled my mom free, dragging her back from the fridge as we collapsed together onto the floor. We were both covered in the smeared black liquid, but I couldn't feel anything but relief as we held each other, gasping, watching as the roots inched back into the jar. Meters of roots compressed themselves into a small, tight mass as they slithered back inside. The last root, in a way that was weirdly human, retrieved the lid and placed it back on top of the jar, which sealed back up with a soft pop. The room was still and silent, as if they had never moved at all, while my world had changed so completely. My mom was so pale, and she could barely speak through her own sobs. "Emma, we need to bury it, far away, where it can't find us again." "But what if it just comes back, Mom? What if what's in there doesn't let go that easily?" My mom didn't answer. I'm sitting at the kitchen table now writing this up. I cleaned up the mess in the kitchen, cleaned the tarry fluid from my skin. My mom's ankle is hurt, but okay. But I don't know what to do with the jar in the fridge. Will it come back if we bury it? Will it burn if we set fire to it? Do we need a priest? What if whatever we do to make it go away makes it come back stronger and angrier? I know this isn't the end of this story. This is only a pause. The things that bound me isn't done. It's just biding. It's time. I was helping my mom move house the other day, and I found a small leather journal in the attic. I asked her about it, and she said it belonged to her grandfather, who was an archaeologist. Apparently, he had a few of these from different digs he'd been on, though she had never read that one in particular. She said I could take it home and read it, but warned me that they could be pretty dry. Seems like my great-grandfather wasn't known for his creativity. I took it home that afternoon and forgot about it for a while. I was reminded of it by, strangely enough, a dream. I was sitting in a field on a rock outcropping reading the journal. I remember, in the dream, being overwhelmed by a sense of serenity, like I was floating, like the grass, swaying gently in the breeze, wasn't grass at all but a vast ocean. Anyway, the next day I made sure to set some time aside for reading. It started out normal and was mostly just logistical things, supplies and such, but then about halfway through the entries took a turn. The only way I can describe them is unsettling. I've been trying to convince myself that he just randomly decided to take up creative writing. I'm gonna write up some of the weirder entries here, hoping that by sharing them, it'll take the edge off a bit. Hopefully we can all laugh at how dumb I'm being. August 24th, 1932. The dig has been nothing short of a disaster. We found nothing and the money is running out. I knew it was a gamble, and it took more than enough convincing from the committee to secure the grant. The books that led me to this location were entirely suspect. A queer leather-bound tome barely held together by ancient bindings. Strange glyphs covered the front and back in its entirety, scrawled things that had been scarred into the leather itself. The text, it could be called such, inside was entirely incomprehensible, much of it similar to the scrawl on the cover. Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, there was a map on one of the pages. It took months to decipher possible locations. It was a risk, a massive one. I just had a feeling, an inexplicable feeling. It wasn't a particularly good feeling, mind you, but it demanded an answer. It was my decades of work at the college that enabled this trip, and it will be my head if it fails. It pains me to think that if this dig turns out a failure, my so far immaculate career will be tarnished, an ugly, writhing blemish on an otherwise perfect legacy. Is it conceited of me to think about such things? Perhaps, but when one's field is history, you can't help but think about how you will be remembered. What will you leave behind? Will anyone know my name in 80 years? I like to hope so. We have 2 weeks of dig time left, and I've little hope. August 27th, 1932. A fight broke out between Moore and Thompson today. The strangest thing. Moore is one of the most sensible men I know. Likes to keep to himself, never causes trouble. But at tonight's meal, he just lunged at Thompson. Thankfully, they were broken apart before anything could happen. Thompson says he did nothing that knowingly could have drawn the man's ire. Didn't even know he had ire, he said. I spoke with Moore a bit later, after giving him a moment to himself. He didn't say much, just kept saying that he didn't know what came over him and that he was sorry. It must be the stress of the dig weighing on him. He has another one on the way. I tried to reassure him, but he seemed despondent, so I left him alone. I just hope there will be no further incidents. This dig is teetering on the edge of a cliff as it is. August 29th, 1932. Things have just gone from bad to worse. There has been a plague. That is the only way to describe it. Going through the camp, people have been vomiting all through the night. We've considered perhaps that the rations had gone bad, but only a few men have come down with this mysterious illness. It is terrible to witness, violent and disturbing. The substance they expel from their stomachs is... there is no word for it. I have never seen anything like it in my 57 years. Like tar, thick and black and shown, An odd mixture of green and purple. It seemed to move on its own accord, but maybe it was a trick of the light. It must have been that. A simple trick of the light. Or I've been out here too long. September 4th, 1932. It's hopeless. September 9th, 1932. We found something. It's just a glimpse of something. We uncovered an opening, and after lowering a lantern down, we saw some odd stone. Definitely not natural. From the look of it, it was impossibly smooth, and the light bounced off it like nothing I've ever seen. The news has reinvigorated the men, and I couldn't be more relieved of it. I could see they were starting to slip, and the failure of the dig was starting to get to them. We've been out here for 3 months after all, with no sight of anything remotely interesting, and after the sickness, the men needed this morale boost. I've got a good feeling. This will be the find of the century. I know it. September 22nd. We've continued excavation of the structure, as it has become known. September 24th. I've been examining the book that led us to this location, desperate for any sort of clues as to the nature of this ungodly structure. And it remains as endlessly vexing as it was before. I have studied the book, cover to cover, hoping to gain some insight, and each time proves fruitless, the odd runes seeming more and more a jumbled mess each time. I have found something that I seemingly have overlooked in my previous study of the book. A sketch of what I can now discern as our current location, with a strange monolith-like structure reaching impossibly into the sky. Obviously there is nothing of the sort here. There are some phrases in the book, long rambling paragraphs that have the cadence of a sermon. A rambling preaching by a man so lost in his faith it has consumed him. Unfortunately, they make little to no sense at the best of times. The passage, "And we shall indulge in one another and become the Ouroboros of eternity given flesh," seems to be repeated many times throughout. My current theory is that this structure is a place of worship, though to what deity I haven't the foggiest. A cathedral to the forgotten. I don't want to imagine the sort of twisted divinity that would demand such a place. This next part is crossed out but still legible. September 34th. The dreams. They haunt my sleep and I can't escape no matter how much I run. The rest is not crossed out. Disregard this entry. Lack of sleep. October 4th. It's colossal. 2 weeks of straight digging, and we haven't fully uncovered the structure. The walls reveal nothing. They are blank. Working near the stone is odd. You can see your reflection perfectly, but only that. Not the lanterns, not other people. It is truly odd. It has my stomach in knots. Looking into that mirror, you stand truly alone. October 9th. More and more questions and no answers. October 15th. I received a letter from my wife today, and the pain of my family's absence has hit me in a way that I didn't expect. The letter details my daughter's 8th birthday, which I have unfortunately missed due to this dig, just as I regretfully missed her 1st, 4th, and 5th birthdays. The letter details her delight over my present, a small archaeology set that I put together, complete with brush and her own hat similar to the one I sport when I go on digs. My wife noted that she has refused to take off the hat for 5 days now. It pains me dearly that I can't spend these days with my family, but my career is something I hold very dear as well. November 6th. The excavation is almost complete. It has been an enormous undertaking, much more than any of us had anticipated. The area we are uncovering seems to be the front of the structure, having seemingly more decoration, though perhaps that isn't the best word for the odd patterns and curious carvings that line the wall. Queer swirling patterns that wind in on themselves and get lost and tangled. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to them, and my best men cannot make heads or tails of it. No idea of any possible time period or known civilization that could have come from. I can get lost in them for hours. The intricate detail. Every inch I follow reveals new details and patterns only for it to abruptly end, and for me to realize it had seemingly led me nowhere. While the patterns inspire a sense of wonder and vastness that simply cannot be put into words. The carvings inspire something much darker. Faceless heads have been carved into the rock, again, seemingly at random. Due to the previously stated reflective nature of the rock, looking into this blank visages, you would find yourself staring out from the infinite void within, as if you yourself had been carved into the rock. It inspired an odd feeling of fate, or destiny, a silly notion that somehow I had been selected by something higher than my understanding to find this structure. A feeling slithered inside me, while staring into my own seemingly black eyes, that everything in my life, every choice and look and breath, had been guided by an invisible hand. I am rambling. We estimate the size of the structure to be around 120 meters by 195 meters. November 17th. People are starting to talk about going home for the winter, and while it is disappointing, it is also understandable. The pain of missing my own family is starting to weigh heavy on me. The only two who seem to share my vision are Albertson, which is no surprise as he has always been my stalwart defender and loyal companion, and Moore, who has only become more and more withdrawn since his spat with Thompson. He has been taking his meals in his tent, seeming to prefer solitude. He seems to have lost some weight, though he brings his plate back empty after meals, something to keep an eye on. November 27th. It is finally done. The structure has been fully excavated. It is glorious, more so than I could have ever imagined. A colossal monument of imposing nature, some 55 meters high. It is almost otherworldly in its design, like nothing I have seen before. From the ancient Romans to modern-day architects, nothing matches the alien nature of what I have witnessed. The stone is immaculate, which is impossible to even believe, but we scored the outside of the structure, and there wasn't a single nick or scratch to be found. No erosion from water damage, which is odd considering this area gets approximately 950 millimeters of rain a year on average. This is especially strange when taking into account the flat roof of the structure. Never in my years have I seen something like it. Our rough guess estimates of the size were close enough. They will be stated in full in the technical reports. As magnificent as the fully revealed structure is, this victory brings with it a new challenge. There is no entrance. The only thing that stands out from what has been newly uncovered is a 2.74 meter circle in the exact center of the front of the structure. The circle is entirely perfect. It is endlessly frustrating to be denied at this pivotal juncture. December 7th. Everyone else has left with the exception of Albertson and Moore. It feels childish of me to say, but the thought of being alone with the structure sent a powerful chill throughout my being, and to know that I've avoided such a scenario is the greatest of reliefs. Albertson and Moore have my endless thanks due to that fact alone. It is frustrating that our progress may slow with our lack of manpower and the increased caution that comes along with that, but myself as well as the others are determined to see this through, and at the very least discover the inside of this intimidating structure. The entrance to the structure still manages to confound. The circular marking must be indicative of something, most simply an entryway of some kind, but remains resolutely obscure. Many of the men had suggested digging through the wall, but I wouldn't allow it. It was something that I had considered briefly, but had discarded as something too drastic at the current moment. Both Albertson and Moore had agreed with me, though Moore's reasoning of it being a great sacrilege stood stark in my mind and had taken root in an uncomfortable way. I will continue to consult the tome to see if I can glean some insight on this issue. Perhaps some primitive mechanism holds the door closed. I remain hopeful. It simply must open. December 11th. A curious phenomena seems to be occurring that I have no logical explanation for. While my expertise lies solely in the fields of archaeology and history, the stars have always been a subject of interest for me. The mystery and majesty of the night sky while on a dig, illuminated in splashes of bright color, is truly a unique sight. It gives a sense of scale like nothing else can. It touches the same sense of wonder that a new find does. While archaeology seeks to explore things lost in the past, the stars are the future. In trying to grasp the possible discoveries of some unfathomable, far-flung future humans is enough to keep one occupied for an eternity. That is all to say that I have a casual familiarity with the night sky, constellations and such, and I am certain there are stars missing, glaring voids where those pinpricks of light should be. I have consulted with Albertson and he agrees with me, though pointed out that some form of light pollution or other natural phenomena could be the cause. December 15th. The structure is open. I wish I could claim some level of responsibility for this newest success, however I have to admit that I played no part in it. I should be more suspicious of this occurrence, but I find it difficult to assign the proper caution at this moment. The adrenaline that has been coursing through me all day is only now starting to wear thin. Ever since I saw it, the hole, it appeared overnight as if by unnatural means. A simple hole about half a meter in diameter. I must have stood there mesmerized by the twisting shadows that played inside for hours before calling from the others. We debated for a long time on whether or not it was safe to enter, more vehemently insisting that he had to go inside, while Albertson preached caution. Eventually, something pulled me forwards, and without a thought otherwise, I climbed inside the hole, the sound of Albertson's protests fading behind me. It was a tight fit, and the walls were much thicker than we ever would have thought, and it took a good amount of shimmying to force my way through. Just when I thought my sense of claustrophobia would overwhelm me, I tumbled out into a large room. The first thing I noticed was the stale quality to the air, and the lack of any noticeable airflow, as if the air from outside was being prevented from entering. The floor was much the same as the walls, the same black stone that seemed to drink the light, leaving completely nothingness. It was an eerie sight that gave the impression of floating over an unimaginable void. I called back to the others that it was safe to enter, and to pass me my lantern. After they made their way inside the structure, I pushed forward. Albertson and Moore inched along behind me, swinging the lantern this way and that, though the odd nature of the stone meant that little was revealed at any one time. The room seemed bigger on the inside, which was surprising considering the colossal scale of the structure, though perhaps this was due to the reflective nature of the stone. The first thing we found was odd, a small pillar about a meter across. It jutted out from the darkness, a shadow against shadow, made from the same queer stone. The most peculiar thing about it was that it didn't go all the way to the ceiling. In fact, it was hardly half the size of the room. Clearly it wasn't for any kind of structural purpose, which leaves me to conclude that it must be decorative in some sense. Perhaps ceremonial. There were 2 rows of these columns that led to the back center of the chamber. The second and last thing we found instilled in me such a profound sense of dread that I fear will remain with me, even into death. I am infinitely grateful for my cautious pace, and Albertson's quick hand, as those factors prevented me from stepping into a large hole in the ground. As I held my lantern out over the hole, only shadows swam up to meet me. I gained an incredible sense of height as I stood at the precipice, as if standing on the edge of a cliff. The fear that struck me at that moment was something that I will remember always. After I had regained some sense of composure, I pulled out a coin from my pocket and tossed it into the hole, hoping to gain some idea of the depth. It never made a sound. December 16th. The three of us have spent the day inspecting the inside of the structure, taking in the majesty and grace of its architecture. We have agreed to the terms that one person must remain outside the structure at all times, as we are still unaware of the mechanism that caused the entrance to open. I find myself entranced and unnerved in equal measure during my time inside the structure and don't like to linger there for too long. Albertson seems to share my mindset. Moore seems completely fascinated with the structure and will spend hours at a time in there. When I am in there, inspecting the walls and pillars for any clues as to the people who built this place, he would simply stand at the hole gazing into it, as if it were a beautiful vista. December 17th. The hole is an utter paradox in that it is mesmerizing and repulsive all at once. I am certain that it leads to that infernal plane that we mortals call hell. It brings to mind the idea of the maw of a great beast, terrifying, endless, hungry, devouring, consuming all. I am reminded, looking at the whole, of something from my childhood, an old abandoned well that my brother and I had found when out exploring the untamed wilderness of our homestead. I immediately was fearful of the well, my small childish mind not able to comprehend that the well wasn't an inescapable chasm of pure darkness, a place that could hold untold horrors, creatures of purest evil. My brother delighted in scaring me with stories of the monster in the well. I only grew out of my fear once I was slightly older and returned to the well with a torch. I lit the torch, tossing it in the well, illuminating the shadowy recesses that haunted my mind. Once I had seen there was nothing there, my fear easily dissipated. Looking at the hole, I'm reminded of the moment I first laid eyes upon that well, and despite the fact that I'm now a grown man, it instills in me the same horrible terror. I told this to Albertson, and while I punctuated my tale with a small chuckle to try and relieve the tension of it, the uneasy look on his face told me I had failed. He suggested we throw one of the spare lanterns down the hole. Whether he thought that we would find nothing, or a horrific nightmare in the illumination, I wasn't sure. I dropped my lantern into the hole what seems like days ago. I can still see the pinprick of light, as if a single star in an empty night sky. December 8th. I woke up to a terrible sound, a ghastly wailing that struck my soul like a violent attack. Rushing out of my tent, I came face to face with a stricken Albertson, a mirror of my equal mixture of confusion and discomfort. The sound was continuous, a horrible sound that I couldn't picture coming from something human. It came from the structure. We shared a look of trepidation before rushing over there. There was a moment of deliberation, both of us unwilling to go first before I pushed myself forward, squeezing my way through the entrance and into the structure. When I emerged on the other side, what I found scarred my mind in a way I couldn't have imagined. The noise was coming from Moore, a deep, unsettling moaning that echoed off the walls to create a cacophony of sound, hundreds of voices joining his to create a terrible dirge, a solemn hymn to that terrible place. The song was deafening, as if all the souls of the damned were screaming out to me, pleading. Moore was kneeling before the hole, the arms held aloft as if in great exultation. His face, lit by the harsh light of his lantern that rested by his knees, was a paradox of light and dark, frozen in a twisted mockery of jubilation. For a moment, as my eyes adjusted to the intense darkness, I could have sworn I saw a sea of robed figures standing in the room. I rushed over to him and shook him desperately, wanting nothing more than for that terrible noise to stop. It felt as if the sound was seeping into me, and when it finally stopped, It didn't retreat right away. It stayed with me. The man looked at me, but it felt as if he was seeing me from the bottom of a deep well, the water distorting his vision. I had the momentary thought, however much shame it brings me now, to throw the man into the hole. Anything to stop that sound. Finally, my frustration peaked, and I struck the man across the face. The spell seemed to be broken, and he blinked away from whatever fugue state he was in. Albertson and I helped Moore back to his tent where he collapsed on his cot. December 19th. Moore awoke in the middle of the night raving, his voice a shrill screeching that infected the night. He kept saying that he had to be inside the cathedral and that it was almost time. He spoke of the face of divinity, of eternity, and said that they shall indulge in one another. He preached about a grand city built by majestic beings, an ode to a holy pantheon of things so unimaginably vast that the human mind would shatter under the weight of their grace. He muttered about a dream that lasted an eternity, a gift from something deep in the annals existence, a quiver in the miasma of a newly born universe. He cried out about a vast antediluvian realm, where angelic beings made glorious music, a holy ode to life. He called it the Undercity. When I finally managed to calm the man and return him to his tent, he just kept repeating the words, "It's time." December 20th. As I was watching over Moore's tent in the late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the darkness started to infect the sky, I heard a sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, then convinced myself it was simply my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually I had to admit to myself that what I heard had started out as a low groan, had progressed into a bone-chilling wail, filled with a terrible anger. The sound was so excruciating, so all-encompassing, so suffocating, that all I could do was sit in place, staring straight ahead into the dirt and pray to the great Lord above that I would never encounter whatever was making that sound. It sounded as it came to me from across such a vast distance that I couldn't possibly fathom. It felt like it lasted for an eternity. It was as if the sound reached inside of me and dragged some part of me out, into that place, down that hole, lost to the mortal world forever. Eventually the sound died down and I still dare not move. I sat there for what ended up being hours, until the rustling of the Albertsons' tent broke me from my trance. He and I exchanged no words in the wake of what I know we both heard. I retreated to my tent while he took over the watch of Moore's tent. December 21st. What I have witnessed today will forever be scarred into my mind, the hideous consequence of an attack from some unimaginable horror. I awoke to the sound of a terrified scream that invaded my mind like a parasite. Quickly exiting my tent, I came face to face with Albertson. We both wore mirrored expressions of a most solemn dread. In our minds at that moment, we knew without a doubt the sound was coming from Moore, and that he was inside the structure. We both rushed to the entrance of the structure, and after a moment's hesitation, I shared a look of trepidation between myself and my long-trusted companion. I pushed myself through the small passageway that served as the entrance to the structure. Halfway through a paralyzing wave, claustrophobia passed over me, and the terrifying sense that if I passed through the tunnel, I would be irreversibly altered coursed through me. Another horrific howl pieced the fog that had engulfed me, and I pushed myself out into the interior chamber of the structure. The room was lit with the glow of what must have been Moore's lantern, and what I saw cannot truly be described. It seemed to be a mass of flesh, rolling and tumultuous like a stormy sea. It had no eyes, no features that I could discern, and yet as soon as I was aware of it, I knew somehow it was aware of me in kind. The presence of it bore down on me as if 100,000 people suddenly turned to me, and I froze under that intense scrutiny. As an ant looked upon a human being, I looked upon it. It seemed to swell in my vision, grow and grow until it was an impossible size, engulfing everything in sight. It felt as if I lay bare under the gaze of some unknowable deity, some forlorn divinity forgotten to humankind. Before I could be consumed by that unknown, I rushed forward towards Moore. The creature had ensured him somehow, and due to how slowly the thing moved, all I can imagine is that Moore approached it willingly. Getting close revealed more hideous details of the thing, and I once again struck with a timeless terror. The creature wasn't made of flesh, but rot. A huge mass of rot, of discard, of mottled leaves and shed insect carapace, of things forgotten, left behind. The dregs of reality. The smell was thick and cloying, giving the sense of a place forgotten, abandoned for a millennia, an eternity. The thing pulsed and undulated, some kind of vile ichor, a disgusting oil pit of oblivion. I swear for just a moment the face of my long-dead grandfather rose up from that mass to greet me like some hazy memory from the back of my mind. It was a face that I had forgotten long ago, only ever knowing him as a young boy, but I am certain it was him. The sound of my name reached me, and I realized that Moore was wailing, crying out for my help, arm outstretched towards me. I reached out and grasped the man's arm with my own, but at that moment, I realized something was wrong with Moore. His face, his skin was melting into the creature, merging with it into some sick amalgamation of human and thing. I tried to pull back, a desperate panic overtaking me, but it was like trying to pull down a cliffside. With no amount of force I used seemed to have even the tiniest effect. The moment I tried to pull away Moore's hand, what was left of it tightened around my arm with vice-like strength. Looking into the man's eyes, only a fanatical kind of fever remained, and nothing of the man I knew. A searing heat crept up my arm, slowly invading my entire being. The pain was so much that I was barely able to think. All I knew was that soon I would be just like Moore, merged with this creature to be taken back to the ungodly realm within which it dwelled. I knew in that moment that death would be preferable, as by merging with that unholy abomination, I would be so far from our Lord that I could never reach his great gates. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor, my arms still writhing with pain, but my senses returned to me. Albertson helped me up and dragged me towards the entrance in my half-delirious state. With his help, I just managed to escape that oppressive tomb, that damnable cathedral, to some unknowable thing from the dark depths of existence. The pain still coiled around my arm, 1,000 needles stabbing into my skin, and as I looked down, I found my arm in the same horrific state that Moore was in. My skin was moving, transformed into that fleshy mass, as if an uncountable amount of slugs raved in orgy at the deity. The one to which I now know the structure was built in honor. Looking to Albertson, the man was wielding a large machete, and while I knew it was the correct course, the only course of action to take, I didn't relish that idea. I must have passed out at some point as I woke up some time later with my arm bandaged, severed from just above the elbow. I am writing this now as I fear that if I wait any longer, I will try to dismiss these events as some feverish nightmare. January 18th. The committee has declared the dig an utter failure and revoked any remaining grants. I am relieved that I never had to return to that wretched place. The committee sent someone back to the site to collect the equipment and claimed to find no evidence of the structure. I am reluctant to return to the site myself to confirm this. The men don't remember the structure. Only Albertson and I, and perhaps more if, as I suspect, he still exists in some form, have any recollection of the events pertaining to the structure. Both myself and Elbertson are content to go along with this story. What we found inside that pit should remain buried, though I suspect it shall not. It will find a way out. The undergrowth and soil crunched with each step. As I took a deep breath and soaked in the natural beauty around me, it was a moderate 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Birds were singing, and the sun was shining down as I walked along the Strawberry Creek Trail. In about a half mile, I'd go off the trail to the designated backwoods camping area. The bubbling of the stream and the whisper of wind in the branches all sounded like an old friend welcoming me home. I'd always considered Great Basin to be a hidden gem. It's the least visited national park in the States. In a few hours of hiking, I had only encountered 2 other people and 1 dog, and when I stared into the wilderness to camp, I knew for sure I would be alone for the whole week. Working as a high school teacher, I got my fill of people every week. Don't get me wrong, I love my kids, but sometimes between them, my coworkers, supervisors, and angry parents, I could just feel like receding into a shell of jaded mistrust. Coming out here and enjoying the silence and peace of nature always made me feel better. I saw the familiar bend in the trail and started my way off the side and towards Blue Ridge. It was always my favorite spot to set up camp. A beautiful, peaceful meadow right under the shadow of Wheeler Peak. It was a strenuous hike, taking at least 2 days of non-stop marching from the parking area at the trailhead, but it was perfect, and it was always there for me, no matter what had happened in the 358 days leading up to this. I knew this week would be perfect. As I crested the ridge, I looked down at the field of small, flowering bushes. It was exactly as I remembered, always even more beautiful as the setting sun painted it in beautiful red hues. That's when I saw a tent parked exactly where I planned on setting up. It looked like a small one-person tent, green canvas, with a cold fire pit in front. I felt frustrated, then sad, then frustrated at myself for these immature feelings. It's not like you own the park. You can always find a different spot. I knew that rationally I should not be upset by this, but emotionally, it felt like I had been betrayed by a family member. I sighed and trudged my way down to the field, setting down my pack at a spot about 1,000 feet away. Who knows? Maybe this could be good for you. One person with a shared interest instead of the usual crowd at work. I started making camp, trying my best to stay optimistic as I set up my tent and began to arrange a campfire. The sun had set completely by the time the fire was merrily crackling away. I ate a quick meal, just some canned soup I had brought. I'd be going fishing in the morning, but I always packed enough food just in case. I glanced over at the other tent as I chewed slowly. It was almost invisible in the waning moonlight. I hadn't seen anyone enter or exit the tent for the whole 2 hours I'd been there, and the strangest part was, there was no fire or even the glow of a lantern. It must be on some all-day hike. I tried to rationalize it, but something about the old, weathered tapestry, hung in a sloppy triangle shape, made me uneasy. I was being ridiculous, I knew it. It was probably just a leftover from being bitter about having a neighbor in the first place. It made me think about back when I got ripped from my position in the middle school since they had fired a high school English teacher. In a day, my workload and class size doubled. It was the same feeling of something familiar being changed suddenly. I chuckled at myself for being so emotionally brittle. I need to relax and stop overthinking everything. I turned my thoughts to the rest of my week's plans as I slipped into my sleeping bag, letting the gentle breeze lull me asleep. The moon was shining coldly when I woke up with a jolt. I tried to stay still, listening carefully as I heard another twig snap just a yard from my tent. I could make out a dark silhouette, the figure of a man, projected on the nylon of my shelter. He seemed to be pacing like he was looking for something he had misplaced in the night. My heart began to pound as he slowly, quietly approached. As stealthily as I could manage with my heart bursting from my chest, I reached towards my pack, scared to death but still planning for the worst. Inside, I knew my Colt 1911 sat fully loaded just in case. Call me paranoid, but with the amount of mountain lions out here in the basin, I always came prepared. "Hello," the voice came from the figure, which now stood in arm's reach of my tent flap. It sounded tentative, stuttering, almost nervous, like a child going to wake his mother when he had a stomachache. I held my breath, my trembling hand gripping the cold metal of my firearm. "Are you okay?" The voice came again, definitely masculine, but it sounded more confident now, paternal in the way it expressed almost genuine concern. I don't know what possessed me to respond. I think it was reflexive, some innate Midwestern politeness. "I'm fine, just leave me alone," I croaked, a hoarse reply barely quieter than a shout. We sat there in silence for a few more seconds. Then the figure slowly walked away. He stalked off in an almost dejected manner, his head downcast. I shuddered, the interaction surreal and terrifying, but as much as I would have loved to write it off as a dream, I knew I was awake, feeling the indent left on my palm from the vice grip of my pistol. When the sun rose a few hours later, I felt no relief. I knew deep down in my gut the mysterious visitor was from the tent nearby. I resolved then and there to go and introduce myself. I was still trying to rationalize what had happened as perfectly normal. Maybe he was just socially awkward. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Either way, I felt dread tie a knot in my stomach even tighter with each step as I approached. The campsite was even more dilapidated than I initially thought. The tent was torn, with ragged holes in the side, and a small black backpack lay haphazardly by the fire. Looking at the state of the charcoal, I'd estimate no one had used the fire for at least a few months. I hesitated. A few feet from the lean-to, I could see a lumpy human shape in the sleeping bag inside, through the torn patches on the side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice quaking with fear. I sat in silence. Nothing budged, and it felt like even the bird song of the waking world faded away. It was just me and the sleeping form in front of me. His breathing seemed slow, the relaxed inhaling and exhaling rhythmic. With sudden concern for the well-being of my fellow camper, I resolved to try once more. "Hey, are you okay?" The moment the words left my lips, the figure sat up straight. His eyes stared forward, dark hair falling loosely in front of them. He was shirtless, his frame skeletal and pale. He smiled a vacant smile and began to nod slowly. I suddenly felt the way a mouse must feel right before the trap sprung and snapped its neck. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked back to my tent briskly. I had made up my mind. I was moving camp, packing everything up, and heading another half-day south. It wasn't just fear. I also knew I wouldn't be able to relax and enjoy my vacation if I was watching over my shoulder the whole time. But things would need to be significantly worse than a slightly strange, emaciated night owl for me to give up the hard-earned trip. I didn't even bother looking back at the stranger's camp as I made my way down towards Stella Lake. I wanted to take a break and get a quick swim in the ice-cold, snow-fed water. I was stiff after spending the whole night crouched, fondling my 1911. I made it to the lake by noon, dropped my pack on the rocky shore, and set my clothes inside it. I brought swim trunks for this exact reason. As I gasped, I settled into the gently lapping, frosty waves. I saw a party of hikers on the opposite shore and gave a friendly wave. It made me feel safer, knowing that it wasn't just me and the freak I'd seen earlier. I swam a few laps until I began to shiver uncontrollably. I waded back to the shore where I had left my belongings. I grabbed the towel I set out and dried off. It was just after 1 p.m., so if I left now, I could make it to the Spring Creek, where I planned to stay the rest of the trip. I opened my backpack and immediately noticed the absence of the clothes I had just put in. I dug through the pack frantically, laying every article out in a line on the ground. Everything else was exactly as it should be. I was especially relieved to find my gun, but my dirty laundry was gone. In the few minutes I spent in the lake, someone grabbed my shirt, pants, and underwear and ran off into the forest without me noticing. And I bet I know exactly who did it. The stranger from earlier must have followed me. Whatever messed up reason he came to my tent, stole my clothes, I didn't want to know. At this point, I changed my plans completely. I'd work my way back towards the trailhead I had parked at. I'd cut around the base of Buck Mountain through the woods. There was a community trail there, not on any maps, but well worn. I knew that it meant spending one more night in the park since it was a steep hike, but it was the most direct route back. I threw on my extra change of clothes and started a double-time pace up the gentle, rocky slope into the forest. The whole time I was frantically looking at the sides of the trail. Every rustle in a bush, the chirp of a bird, or the knock of a falling acorn made me nearly break my neck as I whipped around. The sun set once again as I was deep in the trees along the side of the mountain. The evening sun no longer seemed beautiful, the pink and orange light casting long, twisting shadows that made me even more jumpy. I made camp hastily. I'd take a quick nap and get moving at first light. It may seem strange considering the situation, but trying to navigate that night in the forest is a death sentence, and I didn't want to get lost, especially if he was following me. I sat, quivering on my bedroll, waiting for the sound of footsteps to throw me into a full-on panic. Despite my anxiety, I drifted into an uneasy slumber. As the sun rose and dappled light fell on my face, I slowly felt my consciousness return. Before I staggered upright, the tent, swaying gently against the wind, was in tatters. Hundreds of small, jagged holes covered the blue synthetic surface, and one, a much larger one, was torn away right at the foot of my makeshift bed. That had been where I left my pack and my boots. Both of these items were gone now without a trace. As I looked closer, I gasped as I saw that each of the holes perfectly matched the shape of a set of human teeth. I let out a choked, desperate cry as I abandoned my shelter and ran into the woods towards the trail. My feet were torn into by small rocks, thorns, and roots with each step. I barely noticed the pain as I sprinted, flight response taking over entirely. The park ranger I ran into must have thought I'd lost it. The way he looked at me with pitying eyes. I hopped his truck, and he was kind enough to take me back to where I'd parked. I told him everything that had happened, words tumbling out in a jumbled mess. As I got out, he called me back for a second. Based on everything that happened, can you give me your contact info so we can follow up if you want to press any charges? The ranger said, his eyes friendly. I agreed, but somehow I doubted he would follow up on the mad ravings of a shoeless hiker. I drove back to the town outside of the park in a daze. My wallet, fortunately, had been in my pocket the whole trip, and the bread and breakfast had some vacancy. I fell back on the bed in my new room and sobbed. It wasn't just the fear of being hunted, nor the disappointment of a ruined vacation, but a sense of relief that overwhelmed me. I spent the rest of the day sightseeing in White Pine County. It's a cute area with some historic buildings and rustic casinos. By the time I came back to my motel room, I almost forgot about my horrifying experience. I went to sleep, but not before triple checking that the door was locked and deadbolted. I tried to get comfortable on the stiff mattress, but the same feeling of being watched kept me awake. I rolled onto my side and tried to screw my eyes shut and force myself to rest. Suddenly, after about 10 minutes in this position, Something happened that made my heart stop. The bed depressed slightly as someone sat down on it, and I could hear something sliding across the sheets. A moist, clammy hand started to stroke my hair gently, the same way you gently pet a kitten. I could hear him breathing, a harsh, ragged sound. I bit my tongue and tried to play possum as the thin, bony fingers began to pluck hairs one by one from my scalp, tears streaming down my face from the pain as he began pulling at clumps of it, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I almost wrenched my arm away when I felt his other hand reaching down and grabbing my own. The hand held mine gently. It seemed almost loving. Without warning, the calloused, rough fingers grabbed my thumb and swiftly yanked off the nail. I screamed involuntarily and fell off the bed in a heap. I could hear the sickening sound of teeth crunching and a soft, childlike giggle coming from my bed. I ran out the door and jumped in my car parked outside. I drove all that night, and most of the next day until I made it home. I still imagined that hideous, emaciated man following me. The fear kept me awake all the way home. After I parked in my driveway, I was briefly terrified by the sudden buzz of my phone. I answered it, hearing the voice of the ranger on the other end. "Hey, we went down to the ridge where you camped. Found 2 tents there, but nobody around," he said, his voice making it clear he was holding something back. "2 tents?" I asked, voice trembling. "Yeah, 1 blue and 1 green, both torn to ribbons." I felt dizzy with fear, knowing that the other tent must be mine. He must have taken it, set it all up again, but why? "We found your pack," the ranger continued quietly. "We can arrange to have it sent to you." I thanked him profusely for his help and hung up. It's been 3 months since this terrible nightmare, and I still haven't gotten a good night's sleep. Worst of all, I still find that sporadically I'll lose random belongings. A sock here and there, a pencil I set down a few minutes earlier, and it's driving me mad. I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe being alone again, but I know for sure I'm not camping ever again. I always liked having my own space. I'd had my fair share of experience with cramped dorms and messy, inconsiderate roommates. It wasn't for me. So when I found a small ground floor apartment near campus, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything I needed. Quiet, private, and fairly cheap. Perfect for my last year of university. Everything was good. Until the neighbors started complaining. It began with Mrs. Reed from next door catching me in the hallway one morning. She looked tired, her eyes heavy with bags. "Elizabeth, are you having late night parties?" she asked, her voice sharper than usual. I blinked, confused. "No, I go to bed at 10. She shook her head, a deep frown settling into her jowls. "I hear music, laughing, banging on the walls. You should be more considerate." I hadn't heard a thing. "I'm sorry, but it's not me, I promise." She squinted at me like she didn't believe a word I said. "Just keep it down." Nights were quiet on my end. I didn't throw parties or invite friends over. I'm a bit of a recluse, honestly. I barely left the apartment aside from classes or library runs. Still, the complaints didn't stop. More neighbors started approaching me in the hallways, their faces drawn and annoyed, asking about the noise, to keep it down. The thing is, though, every night I slept like a rock. Nothing woke me up. Nothing ever stirred. I tried staying up one night to catch the sound, but I was too exhausted. I wasn't going to sacrifice my sleep for something I knew I wasn't contributing to. So I passed out around 11 p.m. with no disturbances. One evening after a long day of studying at the library, I came home to find a note slipped under the door. It was crumpled and hastily written. Noise complaints. Handle it. Next to it, bizarrely enough, was a chocolate bar wrapper. A small amount of slick, melted chocolate still inside. The letter itself smeared in it. I was pissed, to be honest. What the hell? It wasn't even me making the noise, and why? Why stuff your own trash along with the letter? Frustrated and tired, I tossed the note on the counter and the wrapper in the trash. Then I collapsed into bed and fell into a study-induced coma. That was the night things started going missing. At first it was small stuff. Pens, keys, a sock here and there. The usual. Nothing suspicious. They always turned up, but never where I left them. I figured it was stress. Finals were around the corner, and I was so drowsy all the time. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Then one morning, I found my toothbrush sitting on the coffee table. It was damp, tinged brown. The odd thing, I hadn't brushed my teeth yet. I knew I hadn't. I still had morning breath. I started to wonder if I was sleepwalking. Could I have been getting up in the middle of the night, moving things without realizing it, making loud noises? I considered having a friend stay over to keep an eye on me, but that felt extreme. I finally got an answer a week later. While being threatened with eviction due to the unexplained noise complaints, I noticed a panel in the base of my closet was ajar. I froze. The base always looked solid before, nothing loose. Curiosity got the better of me, sliding it open more and more, being met with a stale, cool breeze rising up from below. Stupid, I know, but I peeked my head in, discovering a crawl space. It couldn't be more than 3 feet high, dank and covered in thick, dusty cobwebs. Scattered throughout the space were chocolate bar wrappers. It smelt like mold and sickly sweetness. I guess I was naive. I assumed I'd find some wily raccoons, a stray cat. I turned on my phone's flashlight and peered further in. There were several cushions steeped in mold, discarded soda cans, more chocolate bar wrappers. It smelt of sugar and rank air. No scratching, no animal sounds. But deeper into the darkness, I saw them. 4 pairs of eyes squinting from the light I brought in with me. As my own eyes settled, I realized what was staring back at me. 2 children sat cross-legged on the floor. They were pale, gaunt, with dark circles under their eyes, but their knees rocked with giddy excitement, their smiles smeared with chocolate. The boy let out a small giggle as his eyes met mine. Slumped against the left side was a woman. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused, staring at everything and nothing in particular. And in the far corner, drenched in darkness, was a man, hunched on all fours, watching me intently with a calm expression. "You're finally here." His voice was soft with a hint of malice. He gestured toward the children who were still giggling. "The kids love playing at night. Apologies. They can get a little loud." He smirked, a small, controlled smile. From his pocket, he revealed a tiny glass bottle. "I've been helping you, though. You're a sound sleeper when you're properly dosed." My blood ran cold as the cramped, rank space I peeked my head into began to spin. "You've been drugging me?" He shrugged, nonchalant, then gestured toward the woman slumped in the corner. "My wife doesn't talk much these days, but she enjoys the company." The woman didn't react to being addressed. Something cold brushed against my hand. The little girl was crouched next to me, her fingers icy as she tugged at my own. Her eyes were wide as she stared up at me, her smile never wavering. "Wanna play?" I scrambled backwards out of the crawl space before slumping back in a daze. My limbs felt like lead, my vision blurry. I heard the children let out disappointed cries as the man's face peeked out of the crawl space, half hidden in shadow. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice dripping with menace. "You'll love it here. We all do. Don't we, kids?" High-pitched cheers echoed out. That's the last thing I remember. The sound of happy children and the man's toothy grin rearing up from underneath. And you know what? He wasn't wrong. A difficult transition, as all things are. Didn't sleep the first week, and now I sleep all day. Probably sugar crashing, to be honest. Now I love it here. I've grown fond of the kids and their games. I've come to learn that the wife is called Margaret, and she isn't officially his wife. Sometimes her eyes follow me, and she'll mumble something incoherent, like she has something to tell me, but it comes out twisted. Generally, she's quiet, but I enjoy her company. Mrs. Reed doesn't complain anymore. In fact, I haven't seen her in days. I'm sure she'll understand eventually, just like I did. Anyway, the apartment's finally prepped for a new tenant. $550. A really great bargain in this area, especially with such quiet neighbors. Inquire below. We can't wait to meet you.